Hi, I'm Pastor Ben. This is our ongoing education series, How the Light Shines Through. This is our third video, and this reflects the same topic on our Tuesday night adult education class, here provided for you online, in order that if you were there and want to review what we talked about, you can, or if you are not able to come to Central Lutheran on a Tuesday night, you are able to experience the class. The class is roughly following the pattern of the book, How the Light Shines Through by Chad Lakees. And this discussion is roughly connected to chapter 2 of the book. But the video is not just a summary of the book, it's a class from which the book is a source. Well, first, this week is all about what's really happening. Lakees says, instead of looking at the weather, can you look at the climate? Meaning, there are things that we see happening in the world around us, but what's the cause of those things? And particularly, this book has been the topic of secularization. Is the world getting more secular? This is the fundamental question. And on the one hand, there's not a lot of evidence for that. That is to say, people mostly seem about as religious as they were before, but what way are they being religious? And that has changed dramatically. Most people are familiar with the rise of the religious nones, N-O-N-E, nuns, meaning on some box they would check no religion. However, if we look carefully at their actual belief structures, well, they might have something that often looks quite a bit like belief in spirituality at the very least. There's a lovely sociological analysis collection of essays about the Pacific Northwest, and it argues for a belief in what it calls reverential naturalism. That it's about nature, but the sense of nature that there is something more. It's reverential. But what has changed? Because there was something like a secularization. However, it's not what it once was. There was a time, say in the 1960s, where it was really popular among scholars of religion to think that people were just getting more secular and eventually religion would just drop out of favor completely. Part of the reason they thought that was actually bad data. Peter Berger famously wrote about it in his famous book, Sacred Canopy, still a very good book, but then he later, in the very late 90s, recanted the secularization part of it. And he said the problem was my data, that he was looking at places like the UK, where religious participation is incredibly small, and then he was saying, well, obviously, look at the decline. Nobody goes to church. No one has religious belief. But then it was an assumption that there ever was a time that people were completely religious there, and that there's less evidence for. And so that view has fallen out of favor, that things would just get more secular. But actually, a far more careful, nuanced approach showed there has been a secularization, and Charles Taylor is the main philosopher we're going to dialogue with, who says we are living in a secular age, but we need to understand that rightly. Because if you mean by secular just people don't believe in anything spiritual, well, there's not a lot of evidence for that at all. But what do we mean to be more nuanced and more careful? And then what provides us an opportunity for what it means to be the church in 2025. There is a lot the church could do in a secular age if we understand it rightly. Because if it was just simply nobody believes anything, that would be very different than, well, there is a fundamentally different way people believe, and that it's nuanced and careful, and we can enter into that. So Charles Taylor argues that the concept of secularization is too big a concept on its own. And so he breaks it into three components. The first he calls secularization 1, which is how is society generally becoming less religious, and particularly with respect to the state. And here you have a picture of the Archbishop of Canterbury crowning the English or the King of the UK, and that this role that religiosity just has in the public square is, and especially in governance, is declining. I mean, many, and this is not just something in Europe. Most people will know these two people. That's Richard Nixon, and next to him, Billy Graham. And that there was a simple, much more connection between Christianity, and a particular kind of Christianity, with United States governance. Whether or not that was a good or bad thing is a different conversation, but it simply was the case, and it is less the case. These opportunities are less frequently occurring. Government is less frequently doing this. Some would say it's still happening, some would say it's happening too much, some would say it's happening too little, but that is the first kind of secularization. And what has happened is there's a variety of reasons for that, but the reason that state and religiosity were so tightly connected was really a concept of religion that I always think back to Emile Durkheim's famous book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Behavior, that we looked at the very first of these videos, wherein he saw the way society and the sacred, or what he called the totem, the worship center, were coextensive. To be a member of the society was to be a member of the worship site. And interestingly, deep-held belief was not necessarily part of it. It was about participation in the worship site. So in that model, for the state to be simply the same as the religion, and the two to work together, was completely natural. Of course you did. To be part of a society was to do this. Now, in the United States, we've always had at least some version of a separation of church and state, not necessarily true in other places. But still, one could argue there was kind of this coextensive thing, or as David Martin calls it, isometric. That is, moving together and relating with one another, even if not formally, actually related to be the same thing, so that the religious leader was not the political leader. Still, there was relationship between the two. Well, that only works if there is basically one religious praxis that covers everyone. And one of the things that we absolutely recognize now is the multiplicity of religiosity, but more than that, the way Christianity is one option, or I should say religiosity is one option among others. Everyone knows you don't have to believe in this, believe in anything, in order to succeed and live in life. And so that's secularization one. The second is related to that, which is secularization two, which is the way religiosity is expressed in public spaces, in the public square. Here's an example of a Ten Commandments outside of a courthouse in New Mexico. But just the way there is overt religious activity in public spaces, maybe not formally about governmental leaders, but it's very visible, it's very present. And so the dynamic between church and state has always been in tension, but there was room for the presence of this, and many would argue there's still room for the presence, but it just isn't happening in the way it may have once done it. However, we have to ask a question. We've called these things secularization. Does loss of either of these, that is, religion and the state, or religion in the public square, make a society less religious? Well, not really. People can have very deeply held beliefs, just not expressed in the public square and not in government. And so it's not as if secularization has said there is no such thing any longer as belief. And instead, there's a lot of room for it. There's in fact room for even deeper held beliefs. We'll get to that later. Because what has changed most dramatically in this secular age? Well, it's what he calls secularization 3, and Laquise describes as plausibility. How likely are people to believe? And this is what Charles Taylor would argue is the big change. The other things, especially in the United States, there's always been a separation of church and state, at least at some level. And there's always been some skepticism, at least since the 20s, of the religion in the public square. But this is different. In how likely is it that someone is going to believe? Because there was, we begin with the premise that religion has become one choice among many choices. I already mentioned that. But that to understand that in a dynamic way, as if to say, we all know people who are not religious at all and who do not live a meaningless life. And that's an important caveat because of course, there were always people in every society who did not follow the religiosity of the population or didn't follow religiosity at all. However, they were socially not doing well. It was a very striking statement, and it was kind of an oddball thing to do. Laquise uses the example of the Reformation. The period in which Martin Luther lived, it would have been hard to imagine someone not being religious. It was simply the way people thought. If someone was sick, one of the first questions they had is there a problem of a spirit working among them? And so it's just fundamentally, it would have been difficult to imagine someone not being religious. And probably not even, are you really imagining people stepping outside the space of Christianity? But here, now, religion is one choice among many in order to find meaning, in order to find purpose, and ways you can live productively in society with not being ostracized, but you could be religious or you cannot, and much less you could be any kind of religious. And there's all various sorts. And instead of it being something that is inherited, that it means for, back to Durkheim, to be a member of society, you are a member of this worship space, instead it's a choice. Do I choose to follow or to participate in a religious activity or not? Well, it's kind of up to you. And so that is what one of the aspects of secularization 3 is, that this is a choice that each individual is to make, because after all, they know people, they associate with people who they like, who don't make that choice to be religious. And it's important of that second piece of it's not just the bad people, but people who I like and I respect and who I think are productive members of society who are not in any particular religious space. And so I have to make a decision for myself. What is that going to mean for me? And just because my parents had one view might have given me a background, but it doesn't determine anything for me one way or the other. And we see that again and again with individuals making different choices than their family system. It's probably informed by their family system. It's not as if it's nothing related, but it is a relationship. This is what he calls this plausibility. How plausible is it that someone's going to make this choice? And it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, because on the one hand, fewer people are religious. That's true, at least in a way that would be called traditional religiosity. However, those who do make this choice, it wasn't just inherited. No, I really made this choice. And there can be more opportunity for even greater commitment to this. Durkheim's model of being a member of society meant you just participated in the worship space. It didn't necessarily mean you agreed with the worship space. You just participated. Here, if you are a part of this, then the odds are you really do care about it, or at least some aspect of it. We'll continue looking at this in more depth. But this is what plausibility is about. How likely am I going to make that choice that I do think faith is something that makes sense for me, and religious behavior is something that makes sense for me? Well, we start with plausibility, and we're actually quite familiar with this, even those of us who are deeply religious. And I could illustrate that with things not about religion. And so some of these examples are going to be a little bit silly, but I want to present them here to say, what makes something believable to you? That's plausibility. What makes it believable? There's things you can't prove, but what makes it believable? We have a lot of stuff that we're making judgments about all the time on whether I believe it or not. I'm going to give you a kind of silly example. Take a look at this meme. Breaking: Pope Francis just backed Trump, released incredible statement, spread this everywhere. Most of you are probably skeptical of this. And if you were to look at why, there's probably a few different reasons. And one is actually this little ad came up because it's an example of fake news. But one thing you might look at is when you find, there's a few obvious things. For example, you have a deceased person. Pope Francis is probably not endorsing anyone. But also, if you know anything about Pope Francis, it would be unlikely that he was going to support Trump. But more than that, the first thing you might look at is the source. In our last video, you're encouraged to watch this video from Honora O'Neill, and she really talked about reliability of a source, trusting a source. And her points were that, is the source trustworthy? Is this something that I can trust? And you could show evidence that you are trustworthy in your own behavior. And then, are they competent to actually know what they're talking about? Are they honest, and are they reliable? We talked about that last time at some length. But that really was, do I trust a source? We're talking about religiosity. Do we trust the source? Does this source, is it plausible that I believe this or not? Secondly, just does it resonate with me? I hear something. Do I think that's true? When I see a thing about Pope Francis and Donald Trump, it just doesn't make sense for what I know about Pope Francis or Donald Trump. It just, something kind of doesn't click. Well, I'm going to give you another example. How about this one? O.J. Simpson has CTE, or in this case, had CTE. CTE is the disease that develops from a lot of concussions, changes people's personality, makes them break out in aggressive behavior in some cases. And so, is this one believable? Well, when I asked the group on Tuesday night, the first one nobody believed. This one, the group wasn't so sure. They may or may not have believed that. But I will tell you real fast, there's no verification of that at all. But it's just something that could go out there. Is it believable or not? And then there's another question. Is something believable? Is it plausible? Is it normal? Is this something, when we look at it, that makes sense for how people behave? If it seems completely weird, I'm probably not going to accept it very easily. It's not very plausible. So here, example from 1 Thessalonians 4, which is this question of people who'd stopped going to work and living a normal life. Paul says the following in chapter 4. But we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands. And now here's the kicker. As we directed you, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders and be dependent on no one. The second half of that makes sense. Be dependent on no one. Go to work. Do your work. Because it seems to be the idea that we do get in 2 Thessalonians, that some people stopped going to work because they thought Jesus' return was imminent. Paul also thought Jesus' return was imminent, but he says you need to go to work. And the one reason is sort of obvious, so that you're not dependent on people. But the second one is more interesting to me for this conversation, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders. Not because it'll cause a problem internally, but because it's going to look strange externally. We see that later on in 2 Thessalonians, that one of the points about living a Christian life is living a normal life. It has maybe the meaning for the life that you lead is different, but the way you lead the life turns out to be the same. The hope you have comes from Christ, but it's expressed outwardly in everyday behavior in the regular spaces that you live in. Is it normal? Then the other question for plausibility is it popular? Does anyone follow it? You might be familiar with this person. This is Tom Cruise at some kind of Scientology gathering. And I asked the group on Tuesday night, anyone actually know any Scientologists? And one person raised their hand and said, yeah, but not really very closely. And it's really unclear how many Scientologists there are in the United States, but for a religious movement that has actually grown and lives, it's pretty small. Some estimate as few as 40,000. Others estimate far more, but one of the reasons that it could be difficult and implausible for many people is because very few are following it. And then you have what makes these things plausible. Does someone else I trust believe in it? Does someone I like believing in it? Not just is the source of the religiosity valuable, but is the source that I know, the relationship I have in real life. Is that something that's plausible? And then there's this question of, how can I live it out? You might not know this picture, but this is actually Blaise Pascal. Pascal has the famous wager, well, you may as well go ahead and believe in Christian God, because if you're wrong, no harm. If you don't believe this and you're right, there's no harm. There's no punishment. But he was someone who Christianity emphasized a salvation or damnation, and if you think there's no God and you're wrong, why then that's damnation. So what's the risk? Well, that's actually only half of Pascal's wager. If you really look carefully at it, he's gone through a careful proof of why Christian moral values are the best way to live with one another, and you should accept those just as moral values. Well, then the argument is you're already living it out. Why not try worshiping? Why not try believing it? It's far less ridiculous than it first sounds. But part of this is, if I'm going to believe in something, can it be reflected in my regular life? Is it something that the belief leads to action? And I want it to lead to action. That's important. And it needs to be action that's normal enough that I can accept, but it is, but also different enough that it means something. I want to have deep meaning and purpose. And all of this is simply saying, this is secularization 3. These are questions people have to directly ask when it comes to religiosity. And the challenge is that it leads to the point that reality that we experience is a constructed thing, and not everyone accepts it. That's very different than if you just said, well, I believe in God because God exists, and everyone I know supports that God exists, and it's just never a question in my mind. Now it is a question in my mind. And so I have to weigh all of these different things. Is it conceivable? Is the source of it reasonable to me? Is it this choice rather than that choice? That, to Charles Taylor, that is secularization 3. That process. And I've just listed a few things that make something plausible, implausible. But the point is not whether those things are sufficient, because they're not. People are different. Some people won't care at all about some of those things, and they'll care a lot more about something I didn't list, or maybe care only about one of those things and not the others. But the point is that you have to have that conversation. And that's very different than a society in which that conversation is the conditions of your own choices are set to be that you have to be a wild, outside the box thinker to possibly think of not being religious. Now, everybody thinks about whether you want to be religious or not. Now, Laquise points out, and we're going to get into in more depth in a later video, that is from a Lutheran perspective, this is the gift of faith as a gift of what God is doing to us. It's not about what we're choosing, but it is about how we're living it out. How are we going to be participating in that one way or another. We'll get more into the faith as gift later on and what that can mean distinctively as an opportunity, because so frequently among this world of religion as being just something that's plausible, a lot of people are left completely at a loss. And so the number of people selecting religious none, not because they are strong atheists, but because they look through this and they just say, I can't make a decision. And so you end up just saying nothing. Nothing is not saying a strong disbelief either. We're just lost. And this is, I believe, a very good example of some of what has happened. It's also, by the way, completely individual, what Charles Taylor calls the buffered self. I myself have to make a decision, not just about religion, but about everything. What do I hold? And how do I manage all of those decisions? And there is an exhaustion that we're going to get to later on about finding out who I authentically am, because I have to make all of these individual decisions. And religion was never meant to be an individual thing. It's a collective thing. In community, well, it's hard to do that if I am making my own decision about this own plausibility. We'll get into that in the future. But, of course, there's a flip side. That is, that same question for secularization 1 and 2. Does this prohibit religious belief? Absolutely not. In fact, not only is there religious belief, but there often can be, if I believe it, it's because I really am convinced that this is my purpose and my meaning I gain. And it is affective, it's not completely intellectual. In fact, it's often not very intellectual at all. But that if this is something that does provide me meaning, it is going to give me more purpose, and my dedication to it is maybe more robust than it would have been if it was just simply a societal norm everyone held. So we're going to move into now, what does that leave as the opportunity? But this video was to try to set up what's happening. What's simply happening in the world? And that isn't to say, and it's not as simple as saying people aren't religious anymore. That's not true. But it is saying people are religious differently. They are religious far more individually, and they are stressed about making that kind of decision that they are faced with. And the challenge of how am I feeling about it, well, obviously changes from one time to another. How strong of a purpose do I have? Well, that's going to change in the season of my own life. And so part of what we want to be discussing as we move forward is, where does Christianity fit in 2025, is to say, how do we speak to a community facing this difficulty? That's how do we speak into a secular age? It's not true that religion is just off the table, and that's a gift, because it means that it is very much a viable option. And it's not true that if you grew up in a family with no religiosity that you couldn't entertain it. No, in fact, this is just as true for religiosity as non-religiosity. Everyone is managing these kinds of questions for themselves. And so there is a new opportunity here that we can be looking at carefully. All of that is to come. This was just to try to get us a bigger picture, because it's not as simple as just people don't believe so they don't come to church. Instead, there's a dynamic happening, and we'll continue to explore that, but we need to understand it in order to know how to speak to it. What is the good news of Jesus Christ? Well, we have to know who is listening. Bob Kolb famously asks, when someone wants to know about faith, you always ask, well, why do you want to know? Meaning, what's the premise behind this? And then I can explain it to you, because I need to answer what question you're really asking. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. What's behind what's happening here? What is, in his terms, the climate that's behind the particular weather that we're seeing at this one point in time? Watch for more videos in our Together Tuesday class on how the light shines through. I'm Pastor Ben.